Thank you, and applause before before the talk. I appreciate that very much. I'm here because there are multiple threads that connect Denise and myself. Most relevant is that we come from the same part of the world, generationally separated, yet anchored. Let me turn this on, actually. Generationally separated, yet anchored to the same landscape. I speak as a fellow African of a primordial setting greater than the succession of lifespans that have happened upon it. I speak of it as it persists indelibly, and as I recognize it accompanying Denise, even when distanced by time and space. Those of us who have emerged from it cannot but draw it along. Perhaps such sentimentality is true of any geography that nurtures and sustains, but Denise's African story is more than one-dimensional. The Denise known to the world is most often Denise Venturi, but the person who came to that partnership was Denise Scott Brown, and even more importantly, before that, Denise Lukovsky. This gathering here in Italy pushes further into the question, what did that Denise, Lukovsky and Scott Brown, from Africa, bring to Bob from America, son of Robert or Roberto Venturi from Italy? I would love to have brought you a live response from Denise in response to all these questions, but that has not been possible. Instead, I have over my shoulder Denise as much in person as possible in this very recent portrait by Lynn Gilbert, and I thank her for permitting its use over here. And second is a view from Italy that is an especially compelling one for Denise. And I'm hoping that through these two views, I can bring Denise into our presence here as if she was with us in person. So to begin with, Denise says hi to everyone she knows, is what she said in the room, and also to say thank you to everyone. On this trip, from which this photo that you see on my left, on their trip to Italy in the mid-1970s, Bob and Denise traveled to Atessa. Accompanying them were friends and ex-students, Margherita and Franco Paulis. It may be that this photo was taken by Franco on that very trip. It may be that Margherita or Franco subsequently captured the same tableau and presented the image to Denise. Whichever the case, this confluence stirs up Denise, the urban designer, the city planner, the street lover, the historian, architectural and otherwise, and I will add, the inner African. Here is what Denise has written in reflection in response to such an urban scene. She quotes Corbusier saying, "When streets are straight, the mind is clear," Corbu says. And I, that is Denise, as a young architect saw straight streets as my mantra. However, to me, they represented not mental clarity, but freedom to work with modern opportunities of the machine age. Yet across eras and continents, straight lines in plans for cities, pyramids, monuments, or land and water management projects have said power because they were built for good or ill by mass labor under unitary direction. And the orthogonal grids of many towns with free in their names were built by Roman armies. To me, street grids from ancient Greece to China to Africa and America offer grace, rhythms, and flexibilities. But when Corbu writes, to quote, "Man walks in a straight line because he has a goal, he is that man." He sees himself as a trained expert and believes everyone should agree with the logic of his Athens Charter. Catherine Ingram quotes Corbusier further, saying, "The donkey is the true architect of Europe, and his meandering paths are the real floor plans of grown cities like London and Paris." She describes the almost, quote, "monstrous agency that Corbusier ascribes to the donkey. In his scatterbrained and distracted fashion, he zigzags in order to avoid the larger stones. Or is it ease to climb? A little shade, he takes the line of least resistance." But, Denise asks, when carrying a load in hilly terrain, isn't following contours logical? Wouldn't walking a straight line be illogical? She harkens back to Africa. In South Africa in the 1940s, without knowing Corbu's position, I saw how humans and donkeys wound around contours of hillsides and tramped out paths, angled to suit the loads that they carried. It is clear in this narrative that Denise is beginning to take the side of the donkey. and she would go on in later writings to defend him ardently. But the answer to what does Denise bring is ensconced in the actions preceding her composed serenade, and in the question, what did Denise witness, hear? And were it her behind the camera, which indirectly she is, what does she see? By the way, I would love to know what Bob, in the meanwhile, was looking at. I needn't remind anyone here that this is Bob's ancestral town. His father was born here. Even it is guessed in one of the houses pictured in the image. I imagine it might have had the same tug as Denise for her ancestral Africa. What would Bob's eyes see in this scenario? Something different, something else would be my answer to that. And that suffices, if only to make the distinction that Bob and Denise, while they may witness the same sight and often saw eye to eye, they could and would see differently, each informed by their own pasts. So what does Denise see in this scene? That this is a photograph is important. Much of Denise's seeing is through photography, and as such, it portrays a captured moment. However, this is not a grand tour image, object-focused, composed, and frontally reproduced, though Denise has taken shots of record for the purposes of history, collection, or analysis. Here is a back street, an everyday shot, but it is charged with spontaneous action and anticipation. It is not in stasis. Clearly, the donkey is the star, unwitting, laden, and led, roped in by a thong that holds the triumvirate, including the single-minded but lumbering keeper. On either side, there is voyeuristic bipedal excitement, or not in one case. As sightlines crisscross and distracted feet almost falter, supporting all this action is the classic Italian topography, that incline, challenging up or down, ramp or step. It is a palpable experience. This action-packed photo is not about action for the sake of action. It is not for the kind of thrill sought from a Batman comic. It captures things as they really are, as they work, and as they are in use. This is because in its spontaneity, it captures a seeing rather than looking at, and seeing is prior to and different from looking, Denise will say. In immediacy, reality is caught. The what is rather than the what ought to be, to quote Denise. As young architectural students learning to see, Denise's generation was urged by Corbusier's eyes that do not see, and they crossed the tracks to study factories and backs of buildings. Transitioning from these still lives to the above kinds of photo, meaning the one here, was brought on by several other influences in Denise's life. When Denise traveled in 1953 to Spain, her travel companion and a photography buff, Len Fried, who was exposed to war photography and its immediate inevitability, had a scorn for composition. And this was an eye-opener for Denise. Len's hero, and subsequently Denise's too, Cartier-Bresson, was said to, quote, welcome uncertainty or the moment into his frame. He was deeply important to Denise. And at the AA, the Smithsons taught their students to embrace the as found, encouraging them to understand extant social realities rather than erase them by a top-down design approach. From all this, Denise developed a way of inductive photography. Shoot, she told herself first, and then see what you have taken. During their 1956-57 trip to Venice, she and Robert Scott Brown, quote, learned to catch intriguing sights before they were gone, not to risk losing them while detecting why they were needed. Wildlife photography in Africa, as Robert Scott Brown and his father would know, required a similar urgency. It required you to, quote, grab the moment, just shoot, not literally, or nothing remains. Instead, Denise would confirm that her way of seeing, Denise would confirm that her way of seeing in the felt moment, as here, began in Africa, though unbeknownst to her. Her childhood art teacher and European refugee urged her students to, quote, paint what you see around you, and not an imported European aesthetic of what ought to be. Of her greater teacher, Phyllis Lukovsky, her bush-raised mother, Denise says that she got her eye from her mother and that it was fortified with academic training. Phyllis's interests and therefore her partings were varied: architecture, poetry, photography, but bush life lessons and survival in the bush probably took top billing. This required that you learned using your senses in order to be alert for the here and now existence of the wilderness. It was teaching that sharpened your impulse, exactly the skill that Denise would hone for her photography. Phyllis herself was taught these things through the so-called inexact means of example and storytelling, the latter a way of remembering that is older than writing. When witnessing a hunting scene in African cave painting, the painting is meant to be a mnemonic tool through which you may transport yourself into the thrill of the hunt. A good storyteller can achieve this, dissolve the boundary between spoken word or painting and action. Denise aims in her story through photograph photo essays to do precisely that. Denise's immigrant grandmother now, Becky, also had to subscribe to this in-the-moment existence. In her case, the approach was work with what you have. The lack of a dressing table in the middle of nowhere, South Rhodesia, and the abundance of used empty black-shaped kerosene containers resulted shortly in a customized piece of furniture in her thatched hut. This kind of creative reuse of what was there was simply a pattern of life. Is it craft? Is it pop art? To this day, such creativity, along with engineering, is applied to found objects and thrives in these parts in Africa. For Denise, it opens up to pop art later on in her life and the as-founds of the Smithsons. I can go on much more about this, but just a little glimpse about pop art and the African connection. Becky's immigrant status adds another layer to Denise's way of seeing. Immigrants exist in a liminal zone. The liminality ebbs and flows as you are more this or less that with each generation, an insider and outside, deep and shallow. And this gets transplanted into Denise's activism when she comes to America, missing South Africa and trying to catch it in the streets of South Philadelphia. It is also a skewed vision of the world. What is that building that you see in South Africa that looks like Baroque? Is it mannerism or is it just bad Baroque? Again, it comes back to Denise's what is and what ought to be. And again, another dialogue where one can, on mannerism, that one can talk a whole lot about. I want to leave you with one final image. And that is that the existence of ancient animal tracks that score the ridges of the misty Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa. These tracks were caused by annual migrations over countless generations. These tracks were then adopted by the bipeds of the time and still continue to be used. There is no one who comes from this part of the world who does not know of those amazing tracks that animals make because they need to migrate to higher elevations, and then people follow in those paths, not the other way around. You cannot not be impacted by such realities. So I just want to bring the Atessa donkey back to its African counterpart. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Okay.